At Thanksgiving dinner, my older brother smiled and told everyone that the adults would sit at the main table to talk about real careers and real achievements. Then he looked at me and suggested I take my plate and sit with the kids since I hadn't really achieved anything worth discussing. My son froze beside me, old enough to understand the insult, young enough to feel it cut deeper than it should. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I smiled, picked up my plate, and walked to the small folding table like I'd done it 100 times before. What no one at that table knew was that my silence wasn't surrender, it was timing. Because tucked inside my jacket was a plain envelope, and inside that envelope was the truth about the house my brother loved to call proof of his success. 5 minutes later, when I walked back into that dining room and asked him to open it, the laughter stopped. The confidence drained from his face as he realized the mortgage on the house he was hosting us in had been purchased 18 months earlier by my company. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I simply told him the truth. I paid for the house you just told me I didn't deserve to sit at the adult table in. And that was the moment everyone finally understood what achieving nothing really meant. Thanksgiving had always been loud in my family. But that night the noise felt sharper, like it was cutting instead of welcoming. Mark's house sat on a quiet street outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where every driveway was wide, every lawn trimmed, every porch decorated just enough to signal stability. My brother liked that about this place. It looked the way success was supposed to look. I arrived with my wife Sarah and our son Ethan just as the sun was dropping behind the trees. Warm light spilled from the windows, the smell of roasted turkey and buttered rolls drifted out when the door opened. Hugs followed quick and practiced. Compliments about the house, the food, the weather. For a few minutes it almost felt easy. We gathered in the living room with drinks in our hands. Football murmured from the television. Someone talked about a promotion. Someone else complained about interest rates. The conversation moved the way it always did, circling the same familiar landmarks, and then without much effort it landed on me. So what are you doing now? Still in real estate? Is it steady yet? The questions were polite on the surface, but I recognized the tone. Curious without real interest. I answered the way I had learned to answer over the years. Short sentences, no numbers, no explanations. I said work was fine. I said we were managing. Mark leaned against the kitchen counter, relaxed, confident, already half smiling. He was 49 now, a regional sales director with a clear title and a clear path. When people asked what he did, the answer fit neatly into a sentence. He shook his head like he was amused by something small. "You always say that," he said. "Dan, you have been doing those little projects forever. I do not know how you stand not having something solid." A few quiet laughs followed. Not enough to sound cruel. Enough to sting. I felt the familiar pressure in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like a slow sinking, the sense of being placed back into a role I had never auditioned for. I looked at Sarah. She met my eyes and gave the slightest nod. She knew this moment as well as I did. Mark kept going, warming to his own voice. "Some of us need structure, titles, things you can explain to people. No offense, of course." He lifted his cup as if that softened it. Dinner was called soon after. Mark clapped his hands, already directing traffic. The dining room table stretched long and polished, set with plates my mother only brought out on holidays. There were enough chairs for everyone. No one had counted wrong. Mark stepped forward, still smiling. "Let's make this easy," he said. "Adults at the main table. We have a lot to talk about. Work, life. The kids can sit over there." He gestured toward the smaller folding table near the wall, covered with a plastic cloth printed with orange leaves. Then he looked at me. "Actually, Dan, why don't you and your family take the kids' table tonight? You know until you have some big achievements to share. The room went quiet in that strange way where nothing stops moving but everyone notices. My mother laughed quick and nervous. My father studied the edge of his plate. Someone made a comment about needing more space. No one objected. I felt Ethan stiffen beside me. He was 14, old enough to understand what had just happened, young enough to feel it deeply. He looked up at me, searching my face. I knew what he was asking without words. Are you going to let this happen? For a moment I considered speaking, not shouting, just one sentence. Something calm but firm, something that would make Mark stop smiling and make the room feel the weight of it. Then another thought slipped in, quieter and heavier. What would my son learn from that moment? That dignity came from winning arguments, or that it came from knowing who you were even when others did not. I nodded. I thanked Mark for hosting. I picked up my plate. We walked to the smaller table. The chairs were light and cheap, scraping loudly against the floor as we pulled them out. That sound seemed to echo longer than it should have. Ethan sat down slowly, his shoulders tight. Sarah rested her hand on his knee, steady and reassuring. I took my seat across from them. The turkey tasted fine. The room felt far away, like I was watching it through glass. From our corner I could hear the main table come alive. Promotions, contracts, golf trips, laughter that rose easily, the kind that came from people certain of their place. Ethan leaned toward me and whispered that it was not fair. His voice cracked just enough to make my throat tighten. I wanted to tell him he was right. I wanted to explain everything. Instead, I told him it was okay. Not because it was true, but because I needed him to see me steady. I needed him to understand that this moment did not define us. As we ate, I noticed small things. A spoon clinking against a plate. Someone asking for more gravy. The normal rhythm of a family dinner continuing as if nothing had happened. That was what made it hurt the most, how easily moments like this were absorbed and forgotten by everyone except the one sitting at the wrong table. I let my thoughts drift back over the years. I had been sitting at tables like this for a long time. Not always literal ones. Tables where my work did not count because it did not sound impressive. Where silence was mistaken for failure, where explaining myself only seemed to confirm what they already believed. The difference tonight was subtle, but it mattered. This time I was not quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I knew exactly what I was holding back. The quiet I carried stayed with me as the room kept moving. Forks scraped plates. Someone laughed too loudly at the main table. A bottle of wine passed from hand to hand. I focused on the small sounds, the ordinary ones, because they were easier than listening to what mattered. From where we sat, the adult table looked like a stage. Stories landed cleanly there. Promotions announced with practiced humility. Deals described just enough to impress. Mark held the center without trying. He spoke and people leaned in. When he paused, someone filled the space for him. My name came up once, then drifted away. Dan has always been different, my mother said with a smile that meant well and explained nothing. Different was the word they used when they wanted to move on. I kept my head down and cut my food into careful pieces. Ethan mirrored me for a moment, then gave up and tore at the turkey with the side of his fork. Sarah reached over and straightened his napkin without looking at anyone. She had learned how to protect him without making it obvious. Mark launched into a story about a client dinner. He talked with his hands, palms open, like he was offering proof. People nodded. Someone asked a follow-up. I watched the rhythm of it, the way attention moved easily toward him and stayed there. No one asked me what I had been working on this year. No one asked what I was building or why I stayed up late or what had kept me going when the numbers did not look good. They did not ask if I liked the work. It was simpler to assume the answer. Ethan leaned toward me again and whispered that it was messed up. His voice carried the edge of disbelief, like he still thought adults would correct a mistake if it was pointed out. I told him we were here for family. I said it softly. Sarah glanced at me, reading my VIN the way she always did when she was deciding how much to trust the synths. The room felt warmer as the meal went on. My hands felt cold. I noticed the gravy thickening as it cooled, the rolls drying out at the edges. Small things. Safe things. My thoughts slid backward uninvited to the years when I still believed explaining myself would change something. Around 2010, Mark had already settled into his stride. He had a title that fit on a business card. He wore it easily. I was working long hours in real estate, learning the business from the ground up. There was no neat sentence for what I did. There were spreadsheets and late nights and deals that almost worked. At one holiday dinner, I tried to put it into words. I remember standing by the sink, balancing a plate on my palm. I show houses sometimes, I said, but mostly I look for undervalued places. I work with contractors. I try to structure things so they make sense long term. I heard myself talking too fast. I wanted it to sound respectable. I wanted it to sound like I belonged at that table. My mother smiled a little too wide. "So you show houses," she said. Mark raised his eyebrows and laughed, not cruelly, just enough. "Kind of like a handyman with paperwork," he said. The room laughed. I laughed too, because I did not know how not to. On the drive home, I told myself it did not matter, that they just did not understand yet. A few years later, at a summer birthday party under a rented pavilion, I tried again. Paper plates sagged under burgers, kids ran through sprinklers, Mark stood by the grill talking about growth and bonuses. My father nodded along, pride written plainly across his face. When there was a break, I stepped in and said I had just closed on a small duplex. I said it carefully, not bragging, just sharing. Mark turned to me, smiled, and said, "That's nice." Then he looked past me and called out to someone else about a sales trip. My sentence hung there for a moment, then fell apart. My mother patted my arm and told me I would get there someday. "Keep trying," she said, like I was still practicing. On the drive home that night, Sarah asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. I stared through the windshield and realized something that hurt and steadied me at the same time. They were not confused about me. They were comfortable not understanding. I also saw my own part in it. I had wanted approval. I had wanted them to see me. I had measured myself against their standards and felt smaller every time I fell short. That was on me. After that, I stopped explaining. Not all at once, not dramatically. It happened in small choices. I answered with fewer details. I let conversations move on without chasing them. At first, it felt like giving up. Later, it felt like discipline. Back in Mark's dining room, the present settled in again. Someone asked for the green beans. My father cleared his throat and said almost nothing. Mark laughed and the room followed, though I noticed something small this time. When he reached for his glass, his hand hesitated just a fraction. He glanced at the head of the table, then smoothed his expression and kept talking. It was nothing most people would notice. It was enough for me. Ethan kept looking at me, waiting for a correction that never came. I reached for the serving spoon and added more mashed potatoes to his plate. It was a simple thing. It felt like the only honest one I had. He smiled, a brave, uneven smile meant for me alone. That almost broke me. I looked down at my hands, at the plain band on my finger, at the marks that never showed in family photos. I felt the weight of years settle and then lift just slightly. There were questions my family had never asked because they had never wanted the answers. Across the room, Mark made another joke, and the laughter came back softer now, like even they could feel the edge. I watched him sit in his own house, certain and careful at the same time, and I felt a calm I had not known before. I let the silence stretch. I let it work. And in that quiet space, I began to decide what would come next. The calm that settled in me that night did not come from peace. It came from knowing the shape of things. Once you accept that some rooms are not built for your voice, you stop trying to raise the ceiling. As I sat there listening to the noise move around me, I realized how long I had been practicing this kind of quiet. Not just tonight, not just at family dinners, for years. It started sometime around 2010, though I could not tell you the exact day. Back then, the silence was raw. I stopped explaining because every attempt seemed to make things worse. Every answer felt unfinished. I kept thinking I just needed better words or more time or a clearer result to point at. I believed the next holiday would be different if I could just get there first. There were nights I typed out long emails to my parents explaining what I was working on, how it functioned, why it mattered. I would reread them, edit them, imagine their reactions. Then I would delete the whole thing and shut the laptop. I told myself I would send it when things were more certain. That day never came. By 2014, I was tired of talking. I had learned the business well enough to know it did not reward noise. Deals had their own rhythm. They breathed or they died, often without warning. I scraped together what I had and started a small company. I gave it a name that would not draw attention. Northridge Property Group sounded steady and forgettable, which felt right. The early years were not impressive. I worked out of spare rooms and borrowed offices. I drove more miles than I could count. I read contracts late into the night until the language stopped fighting me. I made mistakes that cost real money. I trusted people who sounded confident and learned how expensive confidence could be. There were days I sat in my car after a meeting, hands still gripping the steering wheel, wondering if Mark had been right all along. Days I almost picked up the phone to explain myself, to say that I was building something real, even if it did not look like much yet. I never made that call. Somewhere along the way, the silence shifted. At first, it had been punishment. I stayed quiet because talking hurt. Later, it became protection. I stayed quiet because I no longer needed approval to keep going. The work filled the space where validation used to live. That was when I met Grace Miller. She was older than me by more than 20 years, sharp-eyed and unimpressed by bravado. We crossed paths through a small investment group that met once a month in a rented conference room near downtown. Most people talked to be heard. Grace talked when she had something to say. After one meeting, she asked me to stay behind. She looked over my numbers without comment, then looked at me. "You do not say much," she said. "Is that because you choose not to, or because no one ever listens?" The question landed harder than I expected. I told her the truth. I said I had learned to be careful with my words. She nodded like she had already known that. Over coffee, a few weeks later, she told me about her own family, how she had been dismissed when she was younger, how success came later, and how the same people who once ignored her suddenly wanted explanations. She said the hardest lesson was not learning how to speak up, but learning when. Silence is not surrender, she said. Silence is how you choose your moment. At first, my quiet had been shaped by hurt. I stayed silent because I felt small. Over time, it became deliberate. I stayed silent because I did not need the room to agree with me anymore. Grace warned me not to confuse patience with invisibility. She said there would come a time when speaking would matter, not for revenge, but for truth. She said that moment would test me more than all the years of keeping my head down. I carried that with me. The work steadied. The mistakes grew fewer. I learned how to say no without explaining myself. I learned how to walk away from deals that looked good on paper, but felt wrong in my gut. At family gatherings, I listened. I smiled. I let Mark fill the space. My mother stopped asking what I was doing. My father nodded and stayed quiet. It was easier for them that way. It was easier for me too. By the time I noticed the change, it had already happened. The silence no longer weighed on me. It moved with me. It gave me room to think. It gave me room to choose. Back in the dining room that night, all of it settled into place. The jokes from the main table sounded distant now. I watched Mark laugh and noticed something I had missed before. Between sentences, his eyes scanned the room, checking that he still held it. When he reached for his glass, his hand hesitated just a fraction before steadying. It was nothing most people would catch. It was enough for me. Grace's voice surfaced in my mind, calm and precise. When the truth comes out, it will not just change how they see you. It will show them who they have been all along. I stayed where I was, hands resting on the table, breath even. The years of not explaining had not erased me. They had shaped me. And as the noise continued around me, I understood that when the time came to speak, the quiet I carried would make room for more than words. It would make room for consequences. That understanding did not leave me when my eyes drifted from the table to the room itself. The walls, the floors, the high ceiling Mark liked to point out whenever someone new visited. His house had always been part of his story, even when he did not say it out loud. It was a big place, 2 stories, stone and siding balanced just right to look impressive without feeling flashy. He bought it in 2009 when the market was still shaky and confidence felt like courage. Years later, in 2018, he refinanced, rolled things together. Talked about it as a smart move, the kind of decision men made when they understood money. That house became his proof, the thing he never had to explain. I had heard every version of the story. How he negotiated the price, how he upgraded the kitchen, how the backyard grill was installed with his own hands, or at least under his supervision. When people talked about Mark, they talked about the house the same way they talked about his job, like it was part of him. Sitting there that night, I saw it differently. Not as a home, but as a structure, something held up by terms and signatures and assumptions. Things I had learned to read carefully. In 2022, my company had reached a point where expansion no longer meant more buildings. Northridge Property Group had settled into a rhythm. The work was steady, predictable enough to think a few steps ahead. A regional bank approached us with a portfolio they wanted off their books. Mortgages bundled together, nothing glamorous. Just paper discounted quiet. I almost walked away. Mortgage portfolios were slow. You earned by waiting, by understanding what you held and respecting the timeline. That kind of patience had become familiar to me. I ran the numbers on my own first. Then I sat down with Kevin Hall, a real estate attorney I trusted because he never rushed and never tried to impress. He explained the mechanics clearly. Ownership, servicing, responsibility. What it meant to step into the lender's place without becoming the kind of man people warned their children about. Everything checked out, clean, transparent, legal. I agreed to the purchase. Weeks later, as I went through the files, one address stopped me. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Same street, same number. The same house where Mark stood now, laughing, certain of his place. I leaned back in my chair and let the air out of my lungs slowly. It was not excitement. It was not anger. It felt like irony settling into something heavier. Kevin noticed the pause. "You know this one," he said. I told him it belonged to family. He nodded and asked the only question that mattered. "Do you want to keep it?" I did not answer right away. I could have sold it back into the market and spared myself the complication. No one would have known. Not Kevin, not the bank, not my family. I drove home that night in silence, the address looping through my thoughts. I imagined holidays, dinners like this one, the way Mark spoke with such certainty. I also questioned myself. I wondered if I was telling myself this was just business because it was easier than admitting it felt personal. I sat with that doubt longer than I expected. What decided it in the end was something simple. This was a legitimate transaction. A sound decision. Pretending otherwise would have meant lying about who I had become. So I kept it. Not to make a point, not to punish anyone. I kept it because it was right. Because backing away would have meant letting my past dictate my present. After that, it became routine. Statements arrived, numbers lined up. I knew the balance, the payment schedule, the margin. I knew exactly how little room there was for mistakes. I paid attention the way I always did. Once, months later, Mark mentioned something about the bank changing names on his paperwork. He waved it off with a laugh, said it was probably nothing. I nodded and said nothing. Back in the dining room, he leaned into his chair, comfortable, generous with his laughter. The head of the table fit him. He spoke like a man who believed the ground beneath him was solid. I watched him without satisfaction or anger, just awareness. There were moments early on when I considered saying something, pulling him aside, explaining it calmly. I pictured his face shifting from confusion to disbelief to offense. I knew how he would hear it, not as information but as a challenge. Silence still felt like the better choice. At one point, Mark glanced in my direction and raised his glass, half smiling like he was being kind. I nodded back steady. For just a second, his smile lingered, then tightened. His eyes moved around the room before he turned back to his audience. It was small, almost nothing. I noticed it anyway. I looked at my parents, my mother talking softly, my father listening, hands folded. I looked at Ethan hunched over his plate, pretending not to care where we were sitting. Beneath the laughter and the clinking dishes, there was a truth no one else at that table knew. The house Mark loved to point to as proof of who he was rested on something far thinner than confidence. As the evening moved on and the noise filled every corner, that truth settled into me fully. While my brother sat comfortably at the adult table, certain of his place, the foundation beneath him was far more fragile than he could imagine, and I was the only one in the room who understood exactly how fragile it was. That sense of fragility did not fade as the evening went on. It followed me back to the small table in the corner where the noise felt distant, as if the room had stretched without anyone noticing. I never checked the time. Those 5 minutes were not something you counted. They were something you felt. The room shifted first, almost imperceptibly. The laughter at the main table came a little too fast, then dropped off. Conversations overlapped and corrected themselves. Someone told a story that did not land and had to be rescued by another voice. The rhythm was off just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Mark's voice rose above the rest. He was talking about work again, about how uncertain things were these days, about how important it was to have something dependable. He spoke in general terms, at first broad and reasonable, then slowly narrowed his focus. Some people bounce around too much, he said, still not looking at me, always chasing the next thing. No structure, no real direction. Eventually that catches up with you. A few heads nodded. Someone murmured agreement. I felt Ethan stiffen beside me. I kept my eyes on my plate. I had heard this tone before. Concern dressed up as advice. Judgment delivered like a favor. Ethan leaned toward me, his voice tight. Why does he keep saying that? Before I could answer, Mark continued. When you have a family, stability matters. Kids need to see what achievement looks like. That was the moment. Ethan straightened in his chair. His face flushed and he spoke before he could stop himself. That's not true. The words came out louder than he meant them to. A few conversations paused. Mark stopped mid-sentence. Sarah reached out and gently pulled Ethan back into his seat, not sharply, not angrily, just enough to anchor him. She met his eyes and shook her head slightly, asking him to let it go. Ethan looked at me then, not confused, hurt. He was feeling it now, the unfairness of it, the way certain voices carried more weight simply because no one challenged them. For a brief second, I wondered if I was overreacting, if this was just another comment, another moment that would pass like all the others. The thought came and went quickly. I met Ethan's eyes and gave him a small nod, not permission, reassurance. Mark laughed and waved a hand, dismissing the tension. "Kids are sensitive," he said. "It's nothing personal." The adults' table relaxed again, but the edge did not disappear. It stayed thin and sharp like a crack you notice only once the light hits it right. I looked down at the table in front of us. The plastic forks bent easily. The paper cups were already soft around the rims. The autumn leaves printed on the tablecloth were faded, curling at the corners where someone had spilled a drink earlier. It was a table meant to be temporary, folded up and stored away when it was no longer needed. I thought about how long I had been treated that way. Something shifted inside me then. Not anger, not embarrassment. The quiet changed shape. It was no longer something I endured. It was something I was using. I thought about the years I had spent explaining myself to people who were not listening, about the nights I had gone home exhausted, wondering if I was the problem, about the choice I had made slowly and deliberately to stop chasing approval. I thought about Grace and her steady voice telling me that silence was how you chose your moment. I glanced toward the kitchen. My jacket was draped over the back of a chair near the counter. Inside the inner pocket was a plain manila envelope. Nothing dramatic, just paper clean and organized. I had brought it without fully committing to what it meant. It felt practical at the time, something I might need or might not. Now I understood why it was there. Mark's laughter rose again as he launched into another story, something about a deal that almost fell apart and how he had pulled it back at the last second. He spoke like a man who believed nothing beneath him could shift. For a moment our eyes met. His smile was easy, familiar. It lingered a fraction longer than usual, as if he were checking something. Measuring. I held his gaze neutral and steady, then looked away. The room felt different after that, not louder, not quieter, charged. I took a slow sip of water and set the cup down carefully. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. Ordinary movements, intentional ones. Sarah watched me from across the table. She did not ask anything. She did not stop me. She simply nodded once, so small no one else could have seen it. She had known this was coming before I did. I leaned toward Ethan and spoke softly just for him. "Stay here," I said. "You did nothing wrong." He nodded, still tense, still watching me. I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped lightly against the floor, the sound cutting through the room more than I expected. A few conversations faltered. I stood up. There was no rush in me, no heat, just the clear sense that the role I had been playing for more than a decade had reached its end. I walked toward the kitchen, reached for my jacket, and slid my hand into the pocket. The envelope was there. I turned back toward the dining room, paper in hand, and took my first step away from the kids' table, letting the silence settle into its final shape. I walked back into the dining room as if I had never left it. The envelope felt light in my hand, almost ordinary, which was part of the point. Paper does not need to be loud to change a room. Mark was in the middle of another story when he noticed me. His words slowed, then stopped. The table did not go silent all at once. It hesitated. A few laughs faded. A fork paused halfway to someone's mouth. The room adjusted itself around the fact that I was standing there. Mark gave me his familiar half smile, the one he used when he wanted to stay in control. "Everything okay over there, Dan?" he said. "Still babysitting?" I did not take the joke. I stepped closer and set the envelope on the table in front of him. It landed softly, barely a sound, but every eye followed it as if it had made a crack in the wood. Mark stared at it, then at me. "What's this?" "Open it," I said. My voice was calm, not cold, not angry, just steady. He looked around, searching for a reaction he could shape into a laugh. My mother's face had lost its practiced smile. My father sat straighter than he had all night, watching me like he was trying to decide who I was. Mark slid a finger under the flap and pulled out the papers. At first, he held them like they were nothing. Then his eyes moved across the page and his grip tightened. The tip of his tongue pressed against the inside of his cheek. A small habit. A tell. He swallowed. "What is this?" he asked again, quieter. I pulled a chair out and sat at the edge of the adult table. I did not take anyone's spot. I simply put myself where I had been denied. I kept my hands visible, palms relaxed. "It's your mortgage," I said. "The loan on this house." Mark let out a short laugh, like a reflex trying to save him. "My mortgage is with the bank. I've had it for years." "You had it with the bank," I said. It changed. He glanced back down, scanning faster now, as if speed could undo what he was reading. The room stayed still. Even the low hum of conversation from the living room seemed to fall away. My mother leaned forward slightly. "Daniel," she said, and stopped like she did not know what the rest of the sentence should be. I kept my eyes on Mark. This was for him to hear clearly. "In 2022, your lender sold a group of loans," I said. "It happens. You would have gotten notices about where your payments are being handled." Mark's jaw tightened. "I don't read every piece of junk mail they send." I watched his eyes flicker, the first hint of panic slipping through the cracks. "It wasn't junk," I said. "It was your account information." He turned another page with a stiff hand. His forehead shone slightly under the dining room light. "So what he said. So they sold it. What does that have to do with you?" I let a few seconds pass before I answered. The silence stretched heavy and clean. In that space, I heard my son's voice from a few minutes earlier, the way it had cracked when he said it wasn't true. I held on to that, not as fuel for anger, but as a reminder of why I was standing here. "My company bought that portfolio," I said. "Northridge Property Group. The paperwork was handled properly, all of it." Mark stared at me like I had knocked the air out of his chest. "Your company," he said. "You bought my mortgage." I nodded once. 18 months ago, the bank was paid in full for your loan," I said. "You still live here. You still make your payments." But the note changed hands. The payments go to the holder of that note now. He looked back at the page and his finger traced a line like he was trying to anchor himself. His breathing changed shorter, uneven. "You're messing with me." I shook my head. "I'm not." My father's voice finally cut through, low and careful. "Is this true, Dan?" I met his eyes for the first time that night and nodded. "It's true." Mark's chair shifted as he pushed it back a few inches, then stopped as if he realized he did not know where to go. He looked around the table, searching for someone to contradict me, to turn it into a misunderstanding. No one spoke. My mother's hands were clasped tight in front of her plate. She looked at Mark, then at me, and something in her face softened into confusion and regret. Mark looked at me again, and this time there was no amusement left in him. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "Why would you buy it?" The easiest answer would have sounded like revenge. I could have given him something sharp, something satisfying. I did not. "Because it was available," I said. "Because it was legal, because it was a good investment." The words landed hard, not because they were cruel, but because they were simple. They did not give him a villain he could argue with. Mark opened his mouth as if to fight, then closed it. No joke could fix this. No title could push paper back into the bank's hands. The air in the dining room felt thinner, like everyone was holding their breath without realizing it. I did not add a speech. I did not list accomplishments. I did not explain my life. I had done enough explaining for one lifetime. I stood up. Mark's eyes snapped up, bracing for something else. There wasn't anything else. I slid the envelope back toward him and left the papers in his hands. They belonged there. Then I turned and walked away from the adult table. I went back to the kids' table and sat down beside Ethan. His eyes were wide. Sarah's shoulders lowered slightly like she had been holding tension in her body and could finally let it go. Behind me, the adult table stayed silent, not the awkward silence of a joke that failed, a different kind, the kind that spread slowly, filling the space where laughter used to live. I picked up my fork. The food had gone cold, but I ate anyway. And I let the truth do what it was going to do without my help. The truth did not stop working just because I stopped talking. It stayed in the house after we left, settling into the walls, into the pauses between sentences, into the way people avoided each other's eyes as plates were cleared. The football got louder than it needed to be. Goodbyes came earlier than planned. The night felt unfinished. Outside, the cold air was clean. Ethan walked close to me, quiet but steady. Sarah squeezed my hand once as we reached the car. She did not ask anything. She did not need to. I did not expect Mark to call the next day. I was in the garage sorting through old boxes when my phone buzzed. His name sat there longer than usual before I answered. "We need to talk," he said. "No edge, no humor, just stripped down." I told him where I was. He arrived about an hour later, parking farther down the driveway than necessary, like he was unsure how much space he was allowed to take now. For a moment he just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes moving over everything. The garage door creaked softly as I opened it. Somewhere down the street a car passed, tires hissing on pavement. We stayed standing. "I didn't sleep," he said. "I kept going over it. The papers, the timing. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." I nodded. I believed him. Not knowing did not erase what had happened, but it explained the way his voice shook. "I built my life around that house," he said, "around what it represented. I thought if I could keep that solid, everything else would fall into place." He rubbed his palms together, then stopped like he realized how exposed that looked. "I was always afraid someone would see through it," he said. "That they'd realize I was just holding things together. So I kept talking, kept pushing. If I stayed ahead, no one would question me." He did not look at me when he said it. It was the first time I saw him clearly, not as the confident older brother, not as the man at the head of the table. Just someone afraid of losing the image he had built his life around. The silence stretched. A box shifted slightly as the heater kicked on. He finally looked up. "You could ruin me," he said quietly. "You know that." I did. I could have enforced every term to the letter. I could have pressed when he was already unsteady. I could have won in ways no one would have questioned. I didn't. "I won't," I said. His shoulders dropped just a little. "Why not?" I chose my words carefully. "Because I don't need to win like that," I said. "And because I don't want my son growing up thinking power is something you use to humiliate people." He swallowed and nodded once. He did not argue. "I'm not asking for favors," he said. "Just time and clarity." "You'll have both," I said, "as long as you meet your obligations like anyone else." That was it. No long explanations, no forgiveness speech, just boundaries clear and firm. He thanked me awkwardly, then left. His walk down the driveway looked heavier than the one that brought him in. Later that evening, my father called. He did not circle the point. "I should have said something years ago," he said. "I saw it happening." I stayed quiet because I thought it would pass. "I thought you were strong enough to handle it." I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. "Being strong isn't the same as being untouched," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry." The word did not fix anything. It did not erase the years, but it was real and it mattered. After the call, I sat alone for a while, listening to the house settle. The furnace hummed. A light clicked off upstairs, ordinary sounds filling ordinary space. I felt lighter. Not because Mark was afraid, not because my father apologized, but because I was no longer carrying the need to explain myself. The weight I had lived with for years was gone. I had choices now, real ones, and I did not need to prove anything to anyone to make them. That night, when I turned off the lights, I realized something else. Neither the years of silence nor the moment I finally spoke had been a mistake. They had both been necessary. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without rehearsing who I needed to be the next day. A few weeks passed after Thanksgiving, and the noise settled into something quieter. Not peace, exactly. More like adjustment, the kind that happens when people learn the edges of a new shape and stop bumping into them as much. We saw Mark again before Christmas. Not for a long dinner, just coffee. He was careful with his words now. Polite, measured. The jokes were gone. So was the need to fill every silence. We did not talk about the house. We did not need to. Boundaries had been drawn, and for the first time they were respected. My parents adjusted in their own way. My mother checked in more often, asking real questions and waiting for answers instead of steering them. My father stayed quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. When he looked at me, there was something steady there. Not pride exactly, recognition. Life went on. Work stayed busy. The winter came early that year. Snow gathered on the edges of sidewalks and melted by noon. Ordinary days stacked on top of each other, which was how I knew things had truly changed. One evening, Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table working through a school project. He was focused, pencil tapping lightly against the paper as he thought. After a while, he looked up. "Why did Uncle Mark say you didn't achieve anything?" he asked. I leaned back in my chair and considered the question. Not the words themselves, the meaning behind them. Some people measure achievement by titles, I said, or by how loud a room gets when they walk into it. Others measure it by how much control they feel they have. He frowned slightly, processing. "Is that bad?" "Not always," I said, "but it can be incomplete." I told him that when people had called me unsuccessful, they were using a narrow ruler, one that only measured what could be seen quickly. Job titles, applause, the kind of success that fit neatly into a sentence at a dinner table. If you measured my life that way, I said, then sure, maybe it looked like I had achieved nothing. He looked at me confused. "But you didn't." I smiled. "No, I didn't." I told him about different measurements, the ability to sleep at night without rehearsing who you needed to be the next day, the ability to protect your family without shouting, the ability to choose your response when someone tried to define you. "Those things don't make noise," I said, "but they matter." He nodded slowly, then went back to his work. The pencil tapping stopped. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, I thought about that phrase again. Achieving nothing. It had followed me for years, sitting in the back of my mind like an accusation I never answered. I realized something then. For a long time, I thought silence meant I was losing, that every unanswered comment, every ignored explanation was proof that I had failed some invisible test. What I learned instead was that silence can be a form of clarity. It gives you room to decide what is worth responding to and what is not. I had built a life without asking for permission. I had learned when to speak and when to let things reveal themselves. I had taught my son something without standing on a stage or raising my voice. If that was achieving nothing, then I was comfortable with it. A few days later, Sarah and I took a walk through the neighborhood as the sun dipped low. The air was cold and sharp, lights flickered on behind windows. Somewhere a radio played faintly. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. Better than okay. She squeezed my hand and we kept walking. I thought about how close I had come over the years to forcing moments that were not ready, about how tempting it is to demand recognition when you feel unseen, about how easy it is to confuse being loud with being right. What I learned was simple, and it took me a long time to accept it. You do not have to explain your worth to people who benefit from misunderstanding it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is live well and let time carry the truth where words never could. If you are listening to this and it sounds familiar, maybe you have been at that table too. Maybe someone once decided your value based on what they could see in 5 minutes. If that happened to you, I would ask you something. When you stayed quiet, was it because you felt small or because you already knew who you were becoming? If this story gave you something to think about, take a moment and let me know. Share your experience or stay for the next one. There are more stories like this, and sometimes hearing them reminds us that achieving nothing is not always what it sounds like. I turned off the lights that night without needing to prove anything to anyone, and that felt like more than enough.